Just after their dinner date, Nkechi and Afam decided to head home. When Afam noticed that she was badly stained, her monthly visitor arrived early that month, and Nkechi could not believe what was happening to her. Afam, with his face filled with disgust, asked why she had to be so dirty to the hearing of everyone around and walked away from her, not caring how she would get home in her current state. People were now staring and pointing at her, whispering between themselves as they watched Afam walk away. Nkechi could not withstand the shame, so she ran quickly to the restroom. On her way, she almost bumped into a young woman who was exiting the restroom, but the tension in her made it difficult to even apologize for what she had done. Nkechi arrived the restroom and quickly locked herself up in one of the toilet cubicles, her heart racing as she replayed all that happened with Afam. This was the third time that Afam was embarrassing her in public. The last time was in his friend's birthday dinner when she finished the food that she was served. Afam called her a hungry goat in front of his friends, who all laughed at her mockingly. For years, Nkechi has endured being put down by Afam, and even if she knew that leaving him was the best decision she could ever take, her heart still beat for him, making it difficult for her to leave. How will I survive without him? And who will love me if I ever leave him? These were the unspoken questions that made Nkechi remain in a loveless and abusive relationship with Afam for over 7 years. She stood in the restroom, tears welling up in her eyes as she tried to wipe off the stains on her dress with some tissue. Her entire body was soiled, and Nkechi began to think of what to do with her soiled dress. She saw a scarf in the corner, and just as she was about picking it up, she caught sight of something which seemed to be moving inside the toilet. Nkechi paused for a moment because she could not believe what she was seeing. It was a premature baby abandoned inside the toilet. Its limbs and arms seemed to still be moving, so Nkechi quickly picked up the baby and ran out of the restroom, not caring about her stained dress. Everyone stared at her, wondering what could have happened. Her dress was badly stained with blood, and she had a premature baby in her hands. People could not help but assume that she was the mother of the child. Some even assumed that she tried to have an abortion and was left with a premature baby, hence why her dress was badly stained with blood. How wicked of her to do such to an innocent child, they said amongst themselves as they looked at her with disgust. Nkechi, at this point, did not mind the stares, as all she was focused on was to save the life of the premature child. She arrived at the hospital and the baby was still alive. The doctors and nurses quickly took charge of the child, doing all they could to keep her stable, and after several hours, they returned and informed Nkechi that the baby was now in a stable condition. However, the doctors needed to know how she came about the baby, and Nkechi narrated the entire story to them. All the doctors were stunned as they never expected the baby to survive. They informed Nkechi that the baby was already 5 months old and might end up with several birth defects. The doctors went on to state that the baby would have to remain in the hospital for some months under close observation, and Nkechi urged the doctors to do whatever it takes to keep the child alive. Nkechi, despite hearing all this, was so delighted to know that she saved the child's life. She returned home that evening and met Afam, who was parked in front of her house, waiting. "Where have you been?" He screamed at her angrily, and Nkechi narrated the whole story to him. She informed him how she found a live baby in the toilet and how she had to rush the baby to the hospital before returning home. "So, you think I am so dumb?" he asked Nkechi, who could not understand the reason for his question. "You had a failed abortion, and you are here lying to me that you found the baby inside the toilet in the restaurant. Do I look like a child to you?" He asked Nkechi, who did all she could to convince Afam that the baby was not hers. But Afam already had his mind made up, accusing Nkechi of being a prostitute who was sleeping around with men whilst claiming to still be a virgin. In that moment, something snapped in Nkechi. She had endured Afam's insult for far too long, but now, after everything she had just gone through, Nkechi was ready to face whatever. I am done, she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. I'm done with you, Afam, she said again, looking Afam in the eyes without flinching. Afam's eyes widened, shocked at her defiance. What did you just say? He asked Nkechi, who repeated herself this time even louder. I have wasted 7 years of my life, being humiliated, insulted, and treated like I'm nothing. But today, I realized something. Saving that baby made me feel more alive than I've ever felt with you. I won't waste another minute being humiliated and looked down by you. Afam stood there shocked. He was not used to seeing Nkechi stand up for herself and was convinced that she would regret her decision. You can't survive without me, he said to Nkechi, warning her never to come close to him again. Afam got into his car and drove off, convinced that Nkechi would come begging. Nkechi got into her house. She could not believe how relieved she felt to finally summon the courage to end her 7-year relationship with Afam. It was as if she had been in bondage for all these years and was finally free. All she could think about was the baby in the hospital, and Nkechi found herself praying to God to keep the baby alive. In the weeks that followed, Nkechi visited the hospital regularly, checking on the baby. The doctors were all amazed by the baby's strength and resilience. They all thought she would develop some birth defects, but she seemed to be growing just fine. Despite all odds, the little girl was improving day by day. Nkechi, who had never thought of herself as a mother, began to feel a deep sense of connection with the child. She could not explain it, but it was as if fate had brought them together. Eventually, the doctors asked if she would consider adopting the baby, as no one had come forward to claim her. Nkechi had her mind made up to care for the child if no one ever showed up for her. As the days went by, the baby was handed over to Nkechi, who took her home and began to care for her. Afam was home staring down at his phone. He could not believe that weeks had passed and Nkechi never bothered to reach out to him as he anticipated. Afam could not believe that Nkechi was living just fine without him. His ego was bruised, so he decided to pay her a visit to request for all the things he had ever gotten for her. He arrived in Nkechi's home and heard the cry of a baby. Afam was so furious. He barged into her house and requested for all the things he had ever gotten for her. Nkechi looked at him shocked. She could not believe what Afam had come to do in her house. He stood by her door, his eyes burning with anger as he stared right at her, demanding for all that he had ever gotten for her. Nkechi gently walked into her room and came out with a box containing everything that Afam had ever bought for her during their 7 years together. She never expected this from him, but was not shocked considering how he had treated her for all these years. Afam picked up the box and said to her that she would never find a man willing to marry her. The evidence of your promiscuous life is now evident for everyone to see. Let's see the man who will agree to marry you with this bastard child of yours, he said to Nkechi, who showed him the door and told him to leave and never return. Nkechi could not believe that she spent the better days of her life with such an unruly man, a man who had no atom of regard for her or even cared for her well-being. She looked down at her baby and felt so much love in her heart, a love she had never felt before, and Nkechi, in that moment, knew that everything that happened in the restaurant that day led her to this exact moment. As the days went by, Nkechi was home, pacifying her adopted daughter Nina, when she heard a knock on her door. She quickly dropped the baby in her cot, and the baby began to wail at the top of her voice. Nkechi hurriedly rushed to the door to check who it was and was shocked to see her mother standing in front of her door. "Mama, is everything okay? You didn't inform me of your visit," she said to her mother, who asked her if it was a crime to visit her own daughter. "Mama, I never said it was a crime. I just felt you should have informed me of your visit in case I was not going to be around," she replied her mother, who heard the cry of a baby coming from inside her house. "Do you have a visitor?" her mother asked her as she wondered what a baby was doing in her daughter's house. She quickly walked into the house and caught sight of the baby, who was wailing at the top of her voice. "Whose child is this?" Nkechi's mother asked, her face riddled in confusion as she watched the crying baby wriggle in her crib, wailing for attention. "Mama, she is mine. I adopted her a few months ago," Nkechi told her mother, who could not believe her ears. "You adopted a baby? A single girl like you? You should be focused on finding a husband. Why was I never consulted before you made this big decision?" her mother asked her, as Nkechi apologized to her mother and said that she never informed her because she knew that she would discourage her from adopting the little child. Nkechi then sat her mother down and narrated the entire story to her. Her mother, after listening to the story, asked her why she had to be the one to adopt the baby when there are so many couples out there willing to adopt a child. She explained how caring for her adopted daughter Nena changed her life and helped her break free from her toxic relationship with Afam. Her mother sat there quietly, absorbing everything that she was saying, her expression softening as the story unfolded. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Nkechi, my daughter," she began, her tone filled with emotion. "I have always prayed for your happiness. When I heard how Afam treated you, I worried, but I didn't know how to intervene, seeing how deeply you were in love with him. However, with this child, do you think that you will ever find a husband?" she asked Nkechi, who said to her that any man who loves her genuinely will not have a problem if she has a child or not. Nkechi was not bothered at all, knowing the joy that she derived having the baby in her life. She was willing to risk it all for her and didn't even know why. Her mother stood there as she watched Nkechi cuddle the baby in her arms. She was so worried that her only daughter would end up unmarried. No young man in his right sense would marry a woman with a child when there are thousands of women out there without children, she thought to herself as she pondered on what to do about it. One morning, as Nkechi rushed off to buy some items for her baby, she came across a handsome young man who piqued an interest in her. His name was Echezona, and he happened to live close to where she lived. Echezona offered to escort her home, and they both walked and talked for a few minutes till they arrived at her house. Nkechi could sense a good vibe with him and decided to inform him of her daughter. She did this to ensure that Echezona knew that she had a child of her own. However, when Echezona heard this, he was put off, and this was obvious from his reaction. He immediately told Nkechi that he had somewhere else to be in 5 minutes and rushed off without even saying goodbye. Nkechi was so hurt by this. She got into her house and met her mother, who overheard everything that happened. "You see what you have caused for yourself. No young man in his right senses would want to marry a woman who has a child. You need to decide on what you plan to do with this child before you end up single forever," she said to Nkechi as she walked off to her room angrily. Nkechi stood there sad as everything played back in her head. She knew that it was never gonna be easy finding a single man who would be willing to marry her, but something seemed to reassure her that she was going to be fine. Her mother walked out in that moment and advised her never to tell a man that she had a child. "After all, the child is not really yours," she said to Nkechi, who stood there confused. as she pondered on if to follow her mother's advice or not.